Okay, my apologies. I was in the middle of recording a video. I got a phone call from my dad, and it just automatically decided to drop the recording and not even tell me it did it. It just done. So, what we had was a labor supply shock under the condition where labor demand was perfectly inelastic. So if we have a perfectly inelastic labor demand and there's a labor supply shock, labor supply shifts from LTS over to LTS prime, which causes the wage rate to fall from W star to W prime. But note, if we were to trace everything over, there's no change, there's no shift in aggregate supply, which means there's no shift in the price level, there's no change in output. So production doesn't change. So what's a good way to think about this? Well, a good way to think about this would be, we would have, if labor demand's perfectly inelastic, a great way to think about that would be like the economy is already at full capacity in terms of its labor, right? So if labor, or the labor demand is inelastic, the economy doesn't need any more labor. So if you get more labor, they're like, oh God, okay, fine. You know what, we'll hire you, but we're just gonna cut your wages. So the wage rate falls, but there's no change in output because we're already at max capacity. Meaning there's no shift in aggregate supply and there's no change to the price level. Delicious tea. So if there's no change in the price level, there's no change in aggregate supply, no change in production, what that tells me is if labor demand is perfectly inelastic, then wages will move enough such that no other real variables need to change. Or nominal variables, because the price level doesn't change either. So that would be like being at full capacity. On the other hand, labor demand is perfectly elastic, meaning it's a horizontal rather than a vertical line. Then what we get is no change in wages whatsoever, meaning output, labor hours, and price all change. So can we glean anything interesting out of this? The answer is yes. What can we glean? Well, what we can glean is a very interesting thing. And if we go back to our micro theory, this really isn't much of a surprise. Price is always going to be a rationing mechanism. Always, always, always a rationing mechanism. If the market's allowed to operate totally freely, the price will ration whatever these scarce resources are. On the other hand, if, let's say, labor demand were perfectly elastic, we could interpret that as having a minimum wage in place, for example. If there were a minimum wage that was in place, wages couldn't drop below where they already were. So if there was a minimum wage in place, fixing the real wage to a certain amount, great, awesome, glad to hear it, but the problem is that'll just cause output, labor hours, and thus aggregate supply to shift outward, whereas the aggregate price level is going to change. So the wage rate is fixed, so if you got wage fixing going on, the price level, the aggregate price level, is going to adjust. In the event that you don't, the price level, or in the event that the economy is at full capacity, which means a vertical labor supply or labor demand curve, wages pick up all the slack, labor picks up zero of the slack. So a better way to put it, labor demand is perfectly elastic. Labor hours pick up all the slack. And I'm putting pick up all the slack in quotes because really what it's saying is that they are accounting for all of the shock. They're accounting for all of the change. On the other hand, if labor demand is perfectly inelastic, wages will pick up all of the slack instead, meaning they will account for all of the change. So the elasticity of labor demand is going to be playing a serious role in the event that there is a labor supply shock, because the elasticity of labor demand is going to determine how much wages are going to respond to the shock versus how much labor hours are going to respond to the shock. If labor hours respond to the shock at all, there's going to be a change in output. If labor hours do not respond to the shock, meaning they can't here, right, there's no change to labor hours, meaning there's no change to output. So the closer the economy gets to being at full capacity, the closer we get to having less of a change in labor hours, which translates to less production, which translates to less of a shift in aggregate supply. Now, there is one other thing I want to talk about, but I am not going to talk about it until the problem set has been turned in. The reason being, if I do talk about this, the problem set will be pointless because you'll have all the answers to it. So I hope that I helped you enough with this so far, and if there are any issues, let me know, shoot me an email, and I will do what I can to clear up any confusion. So, thank you for watching, and I guess go to Six Flags Magic Mountain if you ever get the chance, because it's awesome. Of course, don't go now because they're closed.